I've spent my entire career sitting across from people who are drowning in their own storms, but every now and then a case walks into my life that sticks with me long after the camera's shut off. This one started with a look just one defiant glare from a 14-year-old girl who seemed convinced the whole world was against her. And the truth was, she wasn't entirely wrong, but she also had no idea how much of that world she was helping set on fire herself. I remember watching her walk onto the stage like she owned it, chin high, jaw tight, eyes darting like she was daring somebody to challenge her version of reality. And I knew right then I was about to step into a battlefield where logic wasn't going to be my strongest weapon, patience was. Before she even sat down, I could feel the tension humming off her parents like static electricity. They weren't just exhausted, they were defeated. That's the kind of exhaustion you can't rehearse or exaggerate. It comes from months, sometimes years, of watching someone you love spiral so far out of control that you no longer recognize the person standing in front of you. They told my producers their daughter had become unpredictable, angry, reckless, and frighteningly disconnected from consequences. She had run away from home twice, gotten caught shoplifting, been suspended from school more times than her mother could count, and was mixing with kids who had no interest in seeing 15. And somehow, despite all of it, she believed she was the only one in the room who had it all figured out. When I sat down across from her, I wasn't looking at a bad kid. I was looking at a scared kid hiding behind a bad attitude. And that's a distinction most people overlook. Kids don't wake up one morning and say, "Today's the day I become a nightmare." They build that armor out of fear, rejection, confusion, shame, and a whole lot of frustration they don't know what to do with. She had wrapped herself so tightly in that armor that not even her parents' voices could get through anymore. What I saw was an emotional shutdown dressed up like confidence. Her parents started explaining the history, and as they talked, she rolled her eyes so hard it was a miracle she didn't sprain something. Every comment from them was met with a sigh, a smirk, or a muttered, barely contained insult. To her, they were the enemy, and in her mind, the enemy deserved no respect. But underneath that attitude, I kept seeing flashes of something else, a kid who was listening more than she wanted to admit, a kid who flinched at certain details, a kid whose anger was outpacing her ability to understand it. Her mother described a girl who used to stay up late to bake cookies for her class, who cried when stray cats looked lonely, who used to crawl into her parents' bed during thunderstorms because she believed they made her feel safe. And I watched that girl buried somewhere deep inside this hostile teenager show herself for half a second in the way her jaw tightened. That's the thing about emotional truth. It doesn't hide well even when people try their hardest to smother it. But the backstory never comes from just the present day. Kids this angry are rarely angry in a vacuum. There's always a beginning, a middle, and a breaking point. As her parents continued, I kept piecing the puzzle together. The shift started 2 years earlier when her parents separated for 6 months. They thought they were shielding her from their conflict. They thought kids just intuitively understood that adults have complicated lives, but kids don't fill in emotional blanks with logic, they fill them in with fear, and she filled hers with the belief that she wasn't worth staying for. Nobody said it to her, nobody even hinted at it, but she felt it. That's the remarkable and heartbreaking thing about children. They're not always good at articulating emotions, but they're exceptionally good at absorbing them. She absorbed the instability, the slammed doors, the tension at the dinner table, the quiet car rides, the constant uncertainty. Eventually, she learned to weaponize that hurt into defiance. If she was going to be disappointed, she wanted to beat everyone to the punch. Her school painted the same picture. A girl who used to turn in assignments early suddenly started submitting blank pages. A student who used to volunteer to read in class began skipping school entirely. She went from friendly to confrontational, from bubbly to withdrawn, from eager to indifferent. The adults in her life kept addressing the behavior but completely overlooked the wound that was fueling it. Nobody asked her what she was afraid of. They just told her she was being difficult. And you tell a kid she's difficult enough times, she'll start performing the role for you. By the time I got her on my stage, she was no longer reacting to her parents. She was reacting to years of emotional turbulence. She didn't have the tools to process. She told herself she didn't need anybody. She didn't care what anyone thought. She didn't care about the consequences. But people who truly don't care don't show up on my stage. The ones who come to me, even the angry ones, come because some part of them is still hoping to be understood, even when they can't admit it. As she talked, I began to see her pattern clearly. Every time she felt vulnerable, she lashed out. Every time she felt cornered, she lied. Every time she felt misunderstood, she shut down. This wasn't just rebellion, it was self-protection turned self-destruction. And when she said with absolute conviction that no one in her life listened to her, I believe she meant it. But I also believe she'd spent so long shouting that she hadn't noticed the people around her had grown too tired to keep listening. By the time we reached the escalation in her story, the police warnings, the school interventions, the constant fights at home, it wasn't surprising that her parents were hanging on by a thread. I watched her father talk about the night she hurled a lamp across her bedroom and shattered a mirror, and I could hear the pain in his voice when he admitted he didn't recognize the child he'd raised. He wasn't angry. He was heartbroken, and heartbreak has a different sound to it. It trembles. It hesitates. It breaks mid-sentence. And every time he stumbled over a word, she shifted in her seat like she didn't know where to put her emotions. That's when I knew we were getting somewhere. Kids who don't care don't flinch. She was flinching. I could tell she wanted to keep that wall up, but those cracks in her posture were telling me the truth. Her words were trying desperately to cover. You can always tell when a teenager's anger is just a mask they've worn so long that they've forgotten it isn't their real face. She crossed her arms tighter, leaned back in her chair, and tried to settle into that attitude like it was a comfortable seat, but nothing about her looked comfortable anymore. That's usually the moment I know I'm not dealing with defiance, I'm dealing with fear that's been left alone too long. As her parents continued describing the escalation of her behavior, I noticed the rhythm in her breathing change. People underestimate how much the body confesses when the mouth refuses to. She wasn't just annoyed, she was overwhelmed. Her mother talked about nights spent driving around the neighborhood because they didn't know if their daughter was safe. Her father described getting calls from the school so frequently he stopped checking his phone with the hope of good news. These weren't just rules she broke. These were the kinds of choices that forced a family into constant hypervigilance, the kind that makes everyone inside that home feel like they're waiting for disaster to strike. When kids spiral like this, they tell themselves they're punishing the world that hurt them. What they don't realize is how much they're punishing themselves in the process. Every runaway night, every screaming match, every slammed door was another layer of emotional armor she didn't need but believed she couldn't survive without. So she kept adding weight to a shield that was already too heavy for her to carry. I asked her what she thought about what her parents were saying, and she shrugged with that exaggerated disinterest teenagers use to hide the fact that they're listening to every word. She said they were overreacting, that she wasn't doing anything that bad, that everybody her age made mistakes. And I told her she was right. Everybody does make mistakes. But not everybody repeats the same painful patterns, even when the consequences are staring them straight in the face. Mistakes don't define people. Patterns do. And her pattern was loud enough to drown out the girl she used to be. She tried to interrupt her parents several times, throwing out lines designed to embarrass them or deflect the spotlight from her own behavior. But every time she did, her eyes flicked toward them so quickly she probably didn't even realize she was doing it. She was looking for a reaction, for proof that they still cared enough to fight back. Kids who feel unloved don't test boundaries, they stop bothering altogether. She was still testing. That told me she hadn't given up. She just lost her map. As we got deeper into the emotional roots of her anger, it became clear that she had never fully processed the temporary separation between her parents. To her, it wasn't temporary, it was abandonment. And that belief had rewritten the story she told herself about her own worth. When she said, almost casually, that she didn't care if people left because people always leave, I knew we had found the core wound. You don't say a sentence like that unless you've been carrying it around like a truth you never asked for. Her parents looked devastated when they heard her say it out loud. They hadn't known she interpreted that difficult period in their marriage as a referendum on her value. And that's something I see all the time in families. Parents believe kids understand circumstances the way adults do. But children aren't equipped to interpret emotional complexity. They personalize everything. They fill in gaps with the worst possible explanations. And once they adopt that narrative, they use it to justify every destructive decision that follows. When she ran away from home, she didn't do it because she wanted freedom. She did it to see if anybody would chase her. When she shoplifted, it wasn't about the thrill. It was about feeling in control of something, anything, when everything else in her life felt unpredictable. When she skipped school, it wasn't defiance, it was escape. She was trying to outrun a wound that followed her everywhere she went. But wounds don't get smaller when you run from them. They get louder. By the time we got to the point where she was screaming at her parents daily, slamming doors, threatening to leave, shutting down emotionally, and hanging around kids who exploited her vulnerability, she had convinced herself she was the problem. That's the irony of kids who act out the loudest. They're often the ones who blame themselves the most quietly. She had built a life around the belief that she wasn't worth fighting for, and so she acted out in ways that fulfilled her own prophecy. I asked her about the night she threw the lamp, and for the first time she hesitated. She didn't defend it. She didn't justify it. She looked down, fiddled with her sleeve, and muttered that everything just felt too big. That was the first honest thing she said in the entire conversation. Not angry, not sarcastic, honest. When a teenager tells you something feels too big, that's not behavior talking, that's pain. Her father leaned in slightly, not enough for her to notice unless she was looking, but enough for me to catch it. He wasn't afraid of her, he was afraid for her. And that distinction is crucial. Parents who fear their children shut down, detach, or avoid conflict. Parents who fear for their children lean in, even when they're hurting. He was still leaning. I told her that pain left unaddressed doesn't disappear, it just changes costumes. Today it shows up as anger. Tomorrow it shows up as self-sabotage. The next day it shows up as choices that can derail a life before it even begins. And I reminded her that at 14, she wasn't too far gone. She just didn't know how to stop running long enough to let anyone catch up. She didn't like hearing that. Her shoulders tensed. Her jaw locked, but she didn't argue. That was progress. Silence, especially from a kid who's been shouting emotionally for 2 years, is the first sign the truth is landing somewhere deeper than defensiveness. And I was preparing to take her right into the confrontation that would determine whether she was ready to change or ready to keep burning bridges until there was nowhere left to go. I've learned over the years that the moment before a real confrontation is rarely loud. It's quiet, almost unnervingly so. That's the space where the truth has a chance to slip through the cracks, and that's exactly where she was sitting now. The anger she'd been clinging to like a life raft had softened just enough for something else to surface. She didn't realize it yet, but she was standing on the edge of the one thing she'd been avoiding, accountability not just for what she'd done, but for what she'd felt. I leaned forward slightly and told her I wasn't interested in punishing her, embarrassing her, or proving her wrong. I wasn't there to win an argument. I was there to pull her out of a story she'd been trapped inside. But to do that, she had to stop performing long enough for me to meet the real kid underneath. She shifted in her seat and tried to fold back into that defensive posture, but it didn't fit her as neatly anymore. Once a person gets a glimpse of their own truth, even for a second, the old masks start to itch. I asked her what she thought was going to happen if she kept going down the same road. She shrugged again, but this time it didn't have much conviction behind it. I repeated the question slower this time, giving her space to sit with it instead of dodge it. Her eyes flicked up at me, then away, then back to her hands. I've seen that look thousands of times. It's the moment a kid realizes the world is bigger than the narrative they've built to survive it. She finally muttered that she didn't know. I told her that was the most honest answer she'd given all day. Then I pointed out something she wasn't expecting, that not knowing wasn't the problem, pretending she did was. Kids who insist they've got life all figured out at 14 aren't confident. They're terrified of admitting they feel lost. And she'd spent 2 years trying to outrun that feeling. Her mother started crying softly beside her, and the girl snapped, telling her to stop. But it wasn't anger driving that reaction, it was fear. Seeing the people you've been pushing away breaking down because of your actions can be overwhelming, and overwhelming emotions in a teen usually come out sideways. She wasn't trying to silence her mother's pain. She was trying to silence the guilt rising in her own chest. I asked her why it bothered her so much to see her mother cry. She didn't answer. She glared at me like I'd invaded a space she wasn't ready to open. But the glare didn't last. Her eyes dropped to the floor again, and her mouth tightened the way it does when someone is trying desperately not to feel something. I stayed quiet. Silence is uncomfortable for people hiding the truth, and she broke before long. She didn't give a full answer, just a soft, barely audible, I don't know. But I knew that meant she did know, and she didn't have the courage yet to say it. Her father spoke, next voice steady but cracked around the edges. He admitted he was scared of losing her, not to the streets, not to her friends, but to her own pain. He said he didn't know how to reach her anymore. She shifted again, and this time it wasn't just discomfort, it was ache. Kids don't always know how to process love when they've convinced themselves they're unlovable. They reject it, challenge it, twist it into something unfamiliar. But they feel it deeply, painfully, overwhelmingly. I turned to her and told her something she needed to hear, not as a reprimand, but as a lifeline. I said that anger is not a personality, it's a reaction, it's a shield. And shields get heavy when you drag them through every room of your life. She didn't deny it. She didn't roll her eyes. She just inhaled slowly, like she'd been carrying that weight so long she forgot what it felt like to take a full breath. That was when I pressed into the part she'd been running from. I told her she'd been punishing her parents for a wound they didn't know she had, that she'd taken their separation, a moment of adult struggle, and made it the cornerstone of her identity, that she'd told herself she wasn't worth staying for, and every reckless decision she'd made since then was built on that single belief. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't scold her. I just laid the truth out in front of her with the kind of clarity that doesn't leave much room to escape. Her face twitched just barely, but enough. That's how breakthroughs start. Not with tears or apologies or dramatic declarations. They start with a twitch of the face that says, I heard that even if I don't want to. I told her I understood why she felt abandoned. Kids need stability the way lungs need air. When the ground beneath them shifts, they don't sit down and have a rational discussion with themselves about adult hardships. They assume the shakeup was their fault. And once they decide that it shapes everything, I explained that she'd spent 2 years living in a house where love was present but unreachable because she was too busy reinforcing the walls she thought were protecting her. She finally looked at me directly. No attitude, no smirk, just a raw, confused stare that said she wasn't sure whether to fight me or believe me. That's the crossroads every kid like her eventually has to face. I asked one simple question: did she want to keep hurting or did she want help? Her jaw tightened, but she didn't look away. Her breathing deepened. Her foot tapped once against the floor. Those may sound like small things, but in my line of work, they're seismic. She wasn't resisting the question. She was confronting herself. Then her voice cracked, not a lot, but enough to break the tension around her. She said she didn't want to feel this way anymore. She didn't elaborate. She didn't explain. But that sentence, spoken in that tone, told me everything I needed to know. Anger was not her enemy. Pain was. And for the first time she was willing to admit it, her parents both froze. They didn't breathe. They didn't blink. They'd been waiting years to hear her say anything like that. And I wasn't about to let that moment slip away. I told her that change doesn't start with perfection. It starts with honesty. And that was the first honest thing she had shared with any of us. She wasn't out of the woods, not even close, but she had stopped running. And sometimes stopping is the bravest thing a kid can do. We were finally ready for the turning point. The moment where excuses fall apart, truth steps forward, and a child who's been fighting everyone around her finally comes face to face with the one person she's been fighting hardest herself. I could feel the air shift around us as she sat with that admission. When teenagers finally let a little truth slip out, they often act like they've committed some kind of betrayal, like honesty is dangerous, like vulnerability is a trap waiting to snap shut on their pride. She looked shaken, almost disoriented, as though she didn't recognize the sound of her own voice, admitting she didn't want to feel this way anymore. That's the moment I lean into gently but firmly, because that tiny fracture in her armor is the doorway to everything she's been trying to outrun. I told her she had every right to feel hurt. Pain doesn't need permission to exist. But I also told her she didn't have the right to use that pain as a weapon against the people who were trying to love her. She swallowed hard, and I could see her wrestling with the truth of that. Kids who are hurting often believe their pain justifies every reaction that comes after it. They think if the world has wounded them, then the world deserves to feel some of that sting in return. What they fail to understand is that the collateral damage usually falls on the people they need the most. Her father leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped tightly like he was holding on to the last threads of hope. He looked at her with a tenderness that contradicted the exhaustion in his eyes. He told her he missed her, missed the girl who used to race him to the car, who used to beg him to stay up a little longer to watch late-night shows, who used to trust him without hesitation. And I watched her jaw tremble at that, just barely, but enough for me to see she still cared. Kids rarely stop loving their parents. They just get lost in the maze of their unmet needs. I asked her what she missed. Not what she was angry about, not what went wrong, what she missed. She froze, taken off guard by a question that didn't fit her usual script. Anger is easy, nostalgia is not. Nostalgia exposes longing, and longing exposes the truth that connection still matters. She looked down again, pulling her sleeves over her hands, a behavior I'd seen in countless teenagers who were trying to shrink into themselves so they didn't have to confront their own emotions. I waited. One thing I've learned is that you can't rush a kid who's been living in emotional survival mode. If you push too hard, they retreat. If you wait just right, they open. She whispered that she missed laughing. It came out so quietly, her parents almost didn't catch it, but I heard it clear as day. That wasn't the voice of a defiant 4-year-old trying to prove she didn't care. That was the voice of a little girl who'd forgotten what joy felt like. A kid who'd been carrying sorrow that didn't belong to her. A kid who'd been trying to act tough while drowning in emotions she never learned how to navigate. Her mother started crying again, but this time the girl didn't snap at her. She just kept staring at her own hands, shoulders curved inward like she was finally allowing herself to feel something real. I told her laughter doesn't disappear, it gets buried. And the more pain you stack on top of it, the farther it gets pushed down. She nodded almost imperceptibly. I reminded her that she had been living in a reactionary cycle, not a deliberate life. Every door she slammed, every rule she broke, every scream she hurled at her parents, it was all a response, not a choice. And when you live your life in reaction to pain, you stop being the author of your own story. You become a character being dragged through the plot. She looked up at me with an expression that held equal parts confusion and exhaustion. I explained that growing up doesn't happen when you turn a certain age. It happens when you take responsibility for the narrative you're writing. That doesn't mean blame. That means ownership. Ownership of your feelings, your fears, your triggers, your actions. Ownership of why you run, why you lash out, why you choose the wrong crowd. Ownership of the fact that the story you've been telling yourself, nobody cares about me, isn't the truth. It's just the story pain told you. She folded her arms again, but not defensively this time, more like she was trying to hold herself together. I told her the one truth she had been refusing to hear: she wasn't out of control because she was bad. She was out of control because she was hurting. And hurting kids aren't hopeless, they're overwhelmed. That's the difference she needed to understand. When a kid believes they're bad, they stop trying. But when they realize they've been overwhelmed, suddenly there's room for change. Her father asked if she wanted help, and for the first time, she didn't roll her eyes or scoff. She didn't lash out. She didn't argue. She just nodded slow and hesitant like someone stepping onto unfamiliar ground. And I told her that nod was the bravest thing she'd done in 2 years. Anger is easy. Acceptance is hard. Asking for help is even harder. But she had just done all three in one breath. I explained to her that healing doesn't mean pretending the past didn't hurt. It means deciding the past doesn't get to control the future. I told her she had to stop punishing her parents for something they didn't do intentionally. Adults make mistakes. Adults fall apart. Adults struggle in ways children can't comprehend. But struggling parents don't mean unloved children. She looked at her father, then really looked at him, and for the first time I saw the anger in her eyes shift into something closer to sadness. That's the moment emotional defenses start to collapse, from rage into sorrow, from sorrow into honesty. She said she didn't know how to stop being angry. That was her truth, and I told her that was okay. You don't have to know how to stop to start healing. You just have to be willing to learn. She nodded again, and this time I saw a tear slip down her cheek. Not many, just one. But that one tear carried 2 years of emotional armor cracking open. Her mother reached out slowly, afraid to shatter the moment. The girl hesitated, then let her mother hold her hand, the first physical connection they'd had in longer than any of them wanted to admit. That simple gesture told me everything. She wasn't unreachable. She was scared, and scared kids don't need lectures. They need structure, truth, and someone who refuses to give up on them. I told her she didn't have to become a different person overnight. She just had to stop believing the lie that she was unworthy of the family sitting beside her. I reminded her that real control doesn't come from breaking rules or hurting people. It comes from choosing honesty over fear, responsibility over anger, connection over isolation. As the room settled into that fragile but hopeful silence, I knew this wasn't the end of her journey. It was the beginning. She still had choices to make, patterns to unlearn, trust to rebuild. But for the first time in a long time, she wasn't running from the truth. She was facing it. In the days that followed, I kept thinking about that moment when she finally allowed herself to feel something other than anger. People assume breakthroughs are these explosive cinematic events, shouting tears, dramatic revelations. But in my experience, real turning points are usually quiet. They come in the form of a softened expression, a settled breath, a loosening of the shoulders. That's when you know a child has finally stopped defending their pain long enough to let someone in. And that's exactly what she did. But a breakthrough, as powerful as it feels, isn't the finish line, it's the starting point. The real work begins when the emotions settle and the choices return. A child can have a moment of clarity and still fall back into old habits the next day if the structure around them doesn't change. So I shifted the conversation toward what her future needed to look like, not as a punishment, not as a rescue, but as a roadmap. She needed something she hadn't had in a long time: consistency. I asked her what she wanted her life to look like in a year. She frowned like the question was too big for her to hold. Most 14-year-olds can't see past Friday, let alone a year. But she tried. She said she wanted to feel normal again. Not perfect, not popular, just normal. That word told me everything. Kids who act out often crave simplicity more than anything else. They want stability, they want predictability. They want to wake up without feeling like they're already losing a battle before their feet hit the floor. I told her that feeling normal wasn't a fantasy, it was a process. And the first step in that process was accepting that pain wasn't her identity, her behavior wasn't her identity, her past wasn't her identity. She wasn't defined by the things she'd done when she was hurting. She was defined by her capacity to grow beyond them. She looked unsure, almost skeptical, because believing in change requires a level of hope she hadn't let herself feel in a long time. But that skepticism didn't scare me. Skepticism means the door is open a crack. Cynicism is what bolts it shut. She wasn't cynical, she was cautious. Her parents listened quietly as we talked about next steps. I could see the hope building in them, but hope mixed with fear. They'd seen progress before that never lasted. They were terrified of believing in this too soon, terrified of being disappointed again, terrified of watching her slip back into the darkness she'd been living in. And that fear is valid. When a family has been through emotional chaos, trust becomes fragile. Even love gets cautious. So I turned to them and told them they had their own work to do. Parents often assume the child is the only one who needs to change. But healing is a shared responsibility. Their daughter needed a safe place to land, but they needed tools to help her stay grounded. They had to stop reacting to her symptoms and start responding to her needs. They had to learn how to listen without jumping to panic, how to guide without smothering, how to stand firm without escalating. Her father nodded slowly, like the weight of that truth was settling onto him. Her mother wiped her eyes and agreed. They weren't looking for a quick fix. They were looking for a path forward. And they finally understood that the path required all three of them walking it together, not just pushing the child from behind. I asked the girl again what scared her the most about changing. She took a long time before answering. When she finally spoke, it wasn't with anger or sarcasm, it was with vulnerability. She said she was afraid she'd mess up again and everyone would give up on her. That fear hit me hard because it's a fear that lives inside so many kids who have been lost for too long. They want to change, but they're convinced that one mistake will undo every step forward. I told her the truth, she would mess up again, not because she was broken, but because she was human. And errors aren't the end of the journey, they're part of it. What mattered wasn't perfection, it was commitment. She didn't need to prove she was a different person overnight. She just needed to show up for herself one honest choice at a time. She listened with a seriousness I hadn't seen in her until that moment, and I knew she was finally absorbing the message instead of resisting it. Her parents leaned in closer, both of them emotionally raw, but united in a way they hadn't been in years. I could see them remembering that they weren't on opposite sides of the table. They were on the same side fighting for their daughter. That unity matters. Kids feel the climate at home more than they hear the words spoken in it. When the environment is fractured, the child fractures. When the environment heals, the child begins to heal too. I turned back to the girl and reminded her that she had a choice now. Not a choice between right and wrong that's too simplistic. A choice between continuing to live in the shadow of a story that was never meant to define her or stepping into a future where she gets to rewrite the narrative with intention instead of fear. I told her she deserved that chance. And for the first time, she didn't look away or shrug or argue. She looked hopeful, hesitant, but hopeful. We talked about practical steps, counseling structure, accountability, communication, not as punishments, but as supports. She agreed to all of them with a sincerity that surprised her parents. And when she did, her mother reached for her hand again, and this time the girl didn't just accept it, she held on. Her father placed his hand on top of theirs, and the three of them formed a connection that had been missing, fractured, and longed for. In that moment, I saw something shift in her, a quiet understanding that she didn't have to carry her pain alone anymore. She didn't have to fight everyone. She didn't have to pretend she didn't care. She didn't have to wear her anger like armor. She had a family willing to walk through the storm with her, not drag her through it. As they prepared to leave the stage, she turned back to me with a look I can only describe as relief mixed with fear, mixed with possibility. That's what healing looks like in the beginning, a complicated blend of emotions that don't yet make sense but feel lighter than the weight you've been carrying. And I reminded her of the one truth she had refused to hear until that day. She wasn't out of control because she was lost. She was out of control because she'd been hurting without a place to put the pain. Now she had a place. When the show wrapped, I sat in my dressing room and thought about her long after the lights dimmed. I thought about how kids don't break overnight. They crack slowly, quietly, and visibly until one day the cracks show. But if you reach them at the right moment with the right truth, with the right compassion and firmness blended together, they don't just stop breaking, they begin to rebuild. I don't know what every day of her future will look like. I don't know how many times she'll stumble or how many times she'll have to remind herself she's not the villain in her own story. But I do know this. She walked out of that studio with a willingness to try, a family ready to support her, and a truth she could finally hear. And that is more powerful than any anger she ever hid behind. If she keeps choosing honesty over fear, if she keeps choosing connection over isolation, if she keeps choosing responsibility over reaction, she has the potential to rewrite her entire life. And I believe she will, because the moment she looked at me and told me she didn't want to feel this way anymore, that was the moment she stopped being just a troubled teenager and started being a young person ready to heal. Sometimes the greatest transformation begins with a single sentence spoken through tears and courage. Hers did.